Alrighty, guys. Hello, welcome to our August Higher Education to Demand Trends webinar. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded, and we will send out the recording and slides to everyone after today's webinar. Please feel free to submit any questions you have through the chat or Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will answer as many as we can live. We'll save some time at the end of the session for some questions. And if we don't get to your question, someone from our team will follow up with you afterward. Today is a special edition of our Demand Trends webinar because we have Grade EI Senior Director of Customer Success and Product, Michael Hunter, stepping in today as our host. In addition to walking us through the latest demand trends across higher ed, Mike will also be introducing our new PES Alumni Insights Dashboard and custom match. We have a lot to cover today, so with that, I will turn it over to Michael to get us started. Michael, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Regan. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm just looking through the people in the webinar already and some familiar faces. So for everyone who I've met already, great to see you again. And for anyone who doesn't know me or I haven't had the chance to meet yet, I am not Bob. I'll be filling in for him today, but hopefully living up to your expectations for him. Like Regan said, I'm our Senior Director of Customer Success and Product. So really myself and the rest of our team are just part of our products, and we're here as a resource for working with this data. Now, jumping in to what we'll be doing today, we're going to be talking about demand trends. No surprise there, but we're going to break that into a few pieces. So I'll talk very briefly about what we mean when we talk about a program evaluation system and what components of data you might want to include in that. Then we'll move into the actual data for today. That's going to be broken into two main sections. So first, we'll have a number of different demand indicators. We'll go through some of the latest Google search data. We'll go through brand new spring new student enrollment data, international demand data, as well as micro-credential data through Coursera. And it'll give you a good sense of demand for different types of programs. Then we'll move into employment and some current indicators of what the employment market looks like, mostly looking at job postings, but also we'll use this as a chance to talk a little bit about using profile data and alumni data to understand employment outcomes, either at a very specific level, think something like graduates of a particular program, or more broadly, just pathways for different graduates across different types of programs. And then we'll finish up with a program of the month for this month. And it's a really interesting example of a program that in many ways has seen a lot of growth, despite some broader headwinds that we'll see elsewhere. So let's go ahead and jump in to the first section. Now, when we talk about a program evaluation system, hopefully for anyone who's joined before, this is something you've seen and this will be a review, but we're really talking about all of the different areas or elements of data that, in our view, should be considered when you're evaluating different programs. Now, probably the most important here is all of this should be data to inform your processes and help inform the people who are completing that evaluation process. This is not data that should be viewed in any way to replace someone's decision making. What's not shown here is kind of the knowledge of the institution and context around different programs and what's important to the institution that needs to be considered. So today we're going to talk a lot about that bottom quadrant on the left-hand side, the markets data. This is where we'll look into things like student demand and what programs are people looking for, or employment outcomes. What kind of outcomes do these programs lead to, and are we comfortable with those outcomes? Or understanding competition, and is this an environment that we feel as an institution we can step into and either find growth for a current program or launch successfully a new program? That's where we're mostly going to focus today. Now, it's also worth calling out, while that's important, it isn't the only piece. On the bottom right, we have margins, and this is really looking at your program economics. So particularly for a current program, understanding things like the cost to deliver that program and what revenue that program brings to the institution, resulting in the overall margin or contribution of that program, and maybe how that compares across different types of programs is important to understand for the broader context of not just is this an in-demand program, but is this a sustainable program that we can be comfortable offering? Now, part of that is also the mission shown in the top left here, but the idea here is all of your programs in some way or another, and everything you do as an institution relates back to who you are and what the institution believes in, your mission. And there are some programs that maybe are very closely tied to that, or mission critical programs. And that's important context to keep in mind when you're doing that evaluation. There's also academic standards, and this can be at the programmatic level, it can be at the departmental level, it can be at the institutional level. But in some way or another, academics do need to be considered as part of this evaluation process. Now, once again, the most important piece here is this is data to inform your decision making. It's data to help you understand what decisions and what directions you may want to move into for any given program, whether it's a new program being suggested and proposed, or whether it's understanding where to invest resources and try to grow your current portfolio of programs. So that's what we mean when we talk about a program evaluation system. Now, let's actually get into a little bit of the data for today. The first section is going to be all about student demand. And like I said at the beginning, there's going to be a number of sources that we look into here. The first one is Google search data or Google keywords. Now, what we're actually tracking here, the way we get this data is for around the 900 or so largest programs by completion volume, which, by the way, represent a little bit over 90% of all program completions in the US. We're tracking a set of search terms. Now, the number of terms that we track vary program to program. For some programs, it's a much longer list because there's many different ways that people search for that type of educational content. And for other programs, there's a little bit of a shorter list of keywords. So the number of keywords we track varies by program. But really, the important thing here is we're tracking keywords that relate back to that type of education. What you're seeing here in the chart is how search volume has changed over the past several years, 2024, 2025, and 2026. And what I'm sure many of you have already noticed is, wow, that's a pretty big drop in search volume from 2025 to 2026. And you would be right. It's actually a 36% year over year change in Google search volume. On average, if you look across all of the months year to date, including July, we're down by about 31% for total search volume 2025 compared to 2026 year to date. Now, there's a couple things to consider here. One is just the broader trend of why that might be occurring. And we'll go into some of the differences across programs in a second. But part of this is understanding that the way people are finding programs, the way people are searching for education is in many ways changing. A big contributor to the decrease in search volume is that search is not the only way people are discovering that type of education. Growing use of AI search or generative searches has contributed to this year over year decline. So overall, we see just a lesser volume or a lower volume of Google search, but it's still a really helpful and important indicator of what programs people are looking for. You always have to view Google search or any search data as a top of the funnel or a pre-enrollment indication of interest in that type of education. And as you start looking by program, one of the things you'll notice is even though we're down overall, that's not uniform across all programs. One example of that is if we look at specifically just associates and certificate programs, here's a list of programs that actually grew year over year. Now, to get onto this list on the screen, we filtered by programs that already had a meaningful volume of search. So this isn't just programs that saw a wild swing of a percent change year over year, but had a very small base to change off of. These are programs that had a minimum of 10,000 searches in July of 2025 and still saw a meaningful growth in search volume. Obviously, the one that stands out here is drafting and design tech. But that one really did have a reasonable volume of search and has seen an enormous increase in search. You'll also see here programs like computer programming in general has seen a very large increase in search volume. And that's one that you'll notice actually throughout today when we look across degree levels and when we look across data sources as an interesting trend in terms of what is growing versus what is not growing. Some other programs here are across a variety of areas, though. I mean, we see machine tool and technology programs. We see mortuary science, court reporting, cooking and culinary arts. So there are a variety of programs that, despite the broader market trend of decrease in search volume, have really found a way to gain some traction in this particular data source. The same is true when we look at bachelor's and above. Here, we see computer programming in general, once again, has seen a significant amount of growth year over year. So, different award level, but that content of computer programming, people looking for that education, has grown year over year in terms of its Google search data. It's interesting also, especially looking at this chart, this is across maybe even a wider range of areas. So we color coded based on broad domains, but seeing, four different arts and humanities programs on this list, seeing a 12% growth year over year in English and language type programs for people searching for keywords that track back to that type of content is one of the really interesting ones that stands out here, despite maybe some broader trends or coverage of English programs. Here's an example of growing interest in that type of education. Now, continuing on through more of the demand data, we view Google search as a very leading indicator of demand, but we always look at multiple sources when we think about student demand, because when multiple sources tell us the same thing, it's a much stronger indication of both what's happening broadly with the overall market, as well as for a given program. Not just what does the search volume tell us about the demand here, but what does enrollment tell us, and what do other data sources tell us as well? So let's look at some of the spring new student enrollment numbers. Starting with certificate and associate programs, the story here is it's basically flat year over year, less than a 1% change. So certificate and associates programs, while they did grow slightly in terms of spring new student enrollments, overall, we're relatively flat. Now, just like any other data source, it's not like that if you look individually at programs. There were some programs that saw significant growth. Once again, looking at certificate and associate programs, building and construction site management saw a 36% year over year change in terms of its spring term new student enrollments. Other programs, diesel maintenance tech, HVAC maintenance tech, and then other areas like business operations or social work across a variety of domains here have seen double-digit percent increases year over year. So just like we saw with Google search, even though we don't see necessarily a big growth in the overall market for enrollment here, we do see a number of programs that grew quite significantly. Bachelors and above, or specifically bachelors here, it's a little bit of a different trend. So what I want to point out here is yes, bachelor's spring 2026 enrollments are down 4% year over year. We had 175 new student enrollments in spring 25. We have 168,000 or so new student enrollments in spring 26. If you look historically here, we're actually still relatively in line with some of these historical levels. We're at a very similar point to where we were at in 2022, for example, for spring new student enrollment. So our current volume is not out of line with where it's been historically, but year over year, bachelor's has seen a dip. If we look into this, this is a little bit of a different chart than what we saw for certificate and associates. The first thing to notice is there's fewer bachelor's programs that saw growth year over year. This is specifically looking at bachelor's programs that had a minimum last year of 1,000 newly enrolled students, so sizable programs already, and now have seen their changes year over year. What we see is already in just this first list, we're down to programs that have actually gone negative or seen some decrease year over year. Now, that's not to say there are no programs, obviously, that grew. Here they are. Logistics in particular, logistics, material, supply chain management, the bachelor's level, it's up 19% year over year. That's one to keep in mind, especially when we get into the employment data. I think you'll see some of the skills in particular we've seen growth in. You'll see in many ways can tie back to this type of program. So it's kind of a trend, not just in this content for education, but in the labor market broadly as well. The other thing to point out here is, yeah, some of these programs like social work, we've already seen today. They showed up as growing programs in terms of Google search data as well. But this is another example where it's somewhat different content areas that saw growth at the associates and certificate level versus what's currently seeing growth in the enrollment data at the bachelor's level. And in particular, I'll just point out, mechanical engineering, registered nursing, history. These programs were not on the list for their associates and certificate. year over year changes for growth, but they are on the bachelor's list for growth. So what's growing at one level is not necessarily what's growing at the other level.
Quick question for you, Michael.
Yeah.
If AI and other search alternatives are playing a part in reducing keyword searches, what new tools exist to kind of replace or gain insight into what those students are looking for now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that I can tell you at Gray, we're currently working on trying to figure out if there's an additional or a different leading indicator we should be looking at. In our view, while the relative importance of Google search maybe has decreased a little bit just with the drop in volume, we still view it as a very useful pre-enrollment indication of interest in a market. Its strength is that it updates very, very quickly. We're able to keep it update, obviously, on a monthly basis. But its weakness is it can be a bit more volatile. A search is not necessarily the same as an enrollment. One thing you'll notice later on today, when we go to the program of the month, the way we approach understanding student demand is through looking at multiple data sources. Specifically, we'll look at Google search data and international demand data as our two very leading indicators of demand. We'll look at new student enrollment data over a longer term, not just for a single term. Typically, we look at it over a trailing year as our current indicator of demand. And then we'll look at completions as our lagging indicator of demand. The reason we do that is when all three of those, or all four of those, I should say, point in a similar direction, it gives you a much stronger signal of what's going on. So to bring that back to your question, we don't necessarily have a perfect replacement for Google search volume, nor would we recommend truly replacing it yet. It's something to keep an eye on. Our real recommendation is look at more than just Google search volume. Look at all of the data sources for a given program or area, and then ask the question of what does the broader data set tell you about changes in that demand? Now, let's keep moving here. The last section for enrollment data is looking at graduate programs, so master's and doctoral programs specifically. And similar to bachelor's, we see about a 3% year over year decrease. Once again, we're not out of line with 2022 or 2023 or even the 2024 volumes for this type of these award levels, but it is a year over year decrease. Now, getting into what grew, this one is a little bit of a different categorization. So, 8 different programs on this list are broadly health-related programs. We see programs like dentistry on here, or PA programs, or a couple different types of nursing programs. Social work is one that showed up, I think, on literally every one of these lists today. So, there's a number of different health and related programs that have really seen growth. The other one, and hopefully this will be the least surprising thing today, artificial intelligence was the fastest growing graduate program year over year, a 51% year over year growth in terms of its new student enrollments for AI programs at the graduate level. Anyone who's taken a look at, completion data, search data, enrollment data has probably seen a similar trend over the past several years. And just by how prevalent it's been in terms of its coverage and how pervasive it's been, I'm sure no one here is going to be surprised by that significant growth in AI programs at the graduate level in particular. Now, these are specifically AI programs, programs that are in AI, a more technical program. This is not necessarily going to capture programs that are more applied or use AI in the context of another content area. For that type of thing, I think we've all seen and would all expect that is largely pervasive throughout almost every type of program. But this specifically is, artificial intelligence as a program within the computer and information science family, a little bit more of a technical program. Now, continuing down our list of data sources, the next one we're going to look at is international demand. And the way we track this is through international page views. One thing I'll note here is kind of similar to Google search volume, I've seen a pretty large decrease in international page views. But what I want to point out is, while yes, we're still down 10% July of 25 compared to July of 26, that's not nearly as large as the July of 24 to July of 25 decrease. What you can see if you look into the chart, those darker blue lines, the what typically are the taller ones, 2024, 2025 is really where we saw a big decrease or a big drop off in international page views. So in some ways, you could look at this as somewhat of a leveling out to a new baseline for international page views. We are well off where we were for the volume of international page views back in 2024. Now, where are these page views coming from? Well, the chart on the right, India is by far and away for July 2026 the biggest origin country where the person looking for this education was located when they completed this page view. So India is by far the biggest here. Obviously, not the only one, but by volume, it's certainly the biggest contributor of international page views. Now, with that decrease, and this is even more pronounced here, there's a shorter list of growing programs. So only three programs grew year over year for their international page views. One program was flat, and after that, everyone else saw some decrease year over year. The three that saw growth, we have data analytics and or data science, bioengineering and biomedical engineering, and we have civil engineering tech. The one that was flat was psychology. So when you're thinking about what programs could international recruitment be possible from, obviously growth does not tell that whole story. You need volume as well to say, is there even a large enough base to do international recruitment successfully for this program? But when we're thinking about trends in what are international students looking for when they look at the US for education, this is a helpful indication of some of the fields that search is going towards. Now, the final source we're going to look at in this demand section is Coursera. And this is looking a little bit differently. So far, what we've looked at has largely been traditional degree programs, bachelor's programs, associate's programs, graduate level programs. Coursera is a really interesting data source to look into. These micro credentials or smaller courses can move a little bit quicker. It's a much smaller volume unit of education. It's a much lower commitment from the student. It's obviously a little bit less expensive. So this market for Coursera and this data can really be an indicator of what types of education or content broadly are people looking for. And it's an interesting place to look for emerging trends in programs. It's also an interesting place to look for emerging trends in what skills seem to be attracting people to those programs. Now, looking at what's grown in terms of Coursera, and you'll see this both here as well as in the skills section, we go into that for Coursera. There's a pretty clear theme here. We categorize this, like you can see on the right, into tech, data, and business. Broadly, I would just say the umbrella of AI and related areas is where there's a lot of growth in this particular data source. The fastest growing program is introduction to generative AI. We have a number of different data and related courses. Some of these, by the way, are part of a longer series of courses that make up a certificate program. But we really see a clear trend. It's tech, it's data, it's business. Those are the areas that, at least for Coursera data, have seen significant growth year over year. Now, this is skills data. So one of the ways that we work with this Coursera data is we take a look at the descriptions of those courses and we look at what are these providers claiming to teach in these courses? What skills are those providers listing as, hey, this is what you'll learn. These are the outcomes you'll get once you've completed this course. How are they marketing this to students is another way of approaching that. And these are the different skills that saw the biggest jump year over year in terms of how many different courses they're mentioned in and how many people are enrolling into those courses. You'll notice an even stronger theme here of AI broadly as an umbrella in terms of what is growing. Now, you see business as well. So this is a good example where some of these are very specific. I'll just say, I'll call out prompt patterns, a very specific skill. It's got a very specific application. And other pieces here, like communication planning or stakeholder analysis, those are much broader. So you'll see a trend both in this skills data as well as when you go into the job posting skills data, that there's a mix of technical skills and durable skills that really have seen growth year over year. And both of those are important to consider when you're thinking about Types of skills would a graduate of any program need to be well equipped with to be a competitive candidate in the current job? Now, let's move out of student demand. It's an important section. It's obviously critical to understand what types of program and education and what level of education are students looking for. What is the market saying there? But the other end is equally important, understanding after graduation, what kind of opportunities are there for graduates and what is the overall employment market doing compared to last year? So let's jump into the first chart here. And this is going to be US job postings. Now, what you'll notice is we are down a little bit for the month of July. So year over year, overall US job postings across all award levels, not for any one, are down by about 3% July this year compared to July of 2025. So that's the broad high level trend to keep in mind here. We are down a little bit year over year. Moving into what's growing, though, when you start cutting this by occupational codes and you start looking at some of the bigger occupational codes, there actually are some large and fast growing areas that what you can see on the right, based on how we categorize this, stretch over a pretty wide range of areas. These are not as concentrated as we saw in maybe that Coursera data, where they're really concentrated in one or two areas for growth. Here, when we look into the job market, we see growth in everything from industrial engineers to physical therapists. Another interesting one on this list, at least I think it's an interesting one on this list, is software developers and QA analysts. One thing I think we've all probably read or heard about is kind of the field of computer science and what that might look like in the future with AI. But we saw an increase in search volume and people looking for computer programming and computer science education on the front end. And here we see a 56% year over year increase in postings for July in terms of that particular occupational code. So while we all heard about it, we actually still see some growth in that area. And it's just an interesting trend to keep an eye on and compare to kind of the broader coverage of that area. Outside of that, though, physical therapists, nursing assistants, there's health and medical related areas that have seen growth. And then you also notice some very broad occupational codes on here. I'll call out general and operations managers, and that can certainly apply to a number of industries, but management broadly as a growing area. Now, these are some of the skills I was mentioning a minute ago when we talked about Coursera. So on Coursera, that's what are providers claiming to teach in those courses? What will a student or a learner in that course have at the end of it? What will they be able to display? These skills come out of the descriptions of job postings. So this is talking about, well, what are employers asking for? And you'll notice it's a variety here. Some of these are very much hard skills or technical skills. Python, for example, artificial intelligence, automation. These are a little bit more specific. You could think about them almost more like requirements of a job. But I also see things in here like operational efficiency or business operations. And those are skills that, well, yes, they will apply more to some titles or areas than others. They're broadly applicable across almost anything that you can do after graduation from the student perspective. So what I would encourage you to do is when you're looking at skills data and you're thinking about what are employers asking for, think about it through the lens of both hard requirements of a job. What skills does a graduate or an applicant for this job just need to have to even be considered? But then also some of these durable skills that maybe are transferable across a broad range of fields, and what skills outside of just the direct content of this program will our graduates also need to be armed with? And that's another way of taking a look broadly at what can a graduate of a particular program go on to do. Anyone who's joined some of our webinars in the past, whether it's this one or others, has probably heard us talk about the way we tie programs to types of outcomes graduates have really gone into. And for many, many programs, people do very general things after graduation. So understanding what does that crosswalk look like? How general of an employment market will these graduates likely go into? And then what skills tie to some of the common or very, very relevant outcomes, whether those fit directly into the content of this program or not, can be a really important way reviewing not just the labor market, but kind of reviewing what are we teaching and what do we need to teach to set our students up for strong outcomes. Now, that's a good transition into the last section for this employment data here. And that's talking a little bit about not just looking at postings and BLS data, but taking a look at alumni data. The way we do this is with our own database of professional profiles. These are alumni profiles that are being aggregated from a variety of different places people are putting them online. LinkedIn is a good example of one of the large sources here. And this is a data source that can be really helpful for understanding broad trends. So one example of that is what are the most common types of job titles or occupational codes for graduates of a given program to go into? Is this program very linear? People go into the field they studied, or is this program very broad and I need to consider employment outcomes from a broad perspective? The other way to use this data is a little bit more specific, a little closer to home, is to say, what are our graduates doing? And one thing we started doing a lot of work with is actually matching a given institution's alumni to our database to help them find a large sample of those individuals and see things like, well, what other institution did they attend for education after us, or who are their employers, or what pathways through employment have they taken? How many of them stayed in the field they studied? How many of them did more general things? Where are they located? Updated contact information, and kind of a whole host of other things that you potentially can learn. Through that, I think possibly the most impactful piece here is being able to filter down and say, this group of graduates, whether that's your institution as a whole, or whether that's just graduates of a particular program, and say, what do they do for work? What's their first job after graduation? What's their second job after graduation, third, fourth, and so on? And then what does that, based on where they're located and what they're doing, infer about the salaries they're likely earning? It's a way at starting to understand which of your programs are leading to the outcomes you think they are, which of your programs are not, are leading to different or surprising outcomes, and then benchmarking yourself and saying, how do our outcomes compare to the broader set of graduates in each of these programs, irrespective of the institution that they attended? So that's our alumni matching. This is one of, for anyone who works with us already, this is one of the dashboards you'll have access to through your Markets app. It's a really interesting one to look at, both very honed in at, let's say, one institution, one program, as well as broadly, and just say, what types of connections can you find from education to employment outcomes? Now, for the last section today, we're going to look a little more specifically at just one program. For today, we're going to look at a bachelor's in cybersecurity. For anyone who doesn't see that little arrow, it's down at the bottom left-hand corner. So that's the program we'll be looking at. Now, what I see when I look at this chart is overall, I'm expecting to see something pretty positive. I see this program, when you combine all of the categories, all of the data we have, it's in the 98th percentile. There's something pretty positive that we'll likely see here. Now, where does that come from? Student demand really seems to be the strength for this program. That's kind of setting my expectations. I'm probably going to see something pretty positive in employment. I see it's in the 94th percentile, and that's a relatively healthy competitive environment, although maybe we have some questions there. It's still positive. It's in the 78th percentile, but it's just not quite as strong, maybe, as its student demand. So let's look a little bit under the hood. Let's see the details here. Looking at student demand, it looks like this is very positive. What I see here is a humongous program. And I say that because it kind of doesn't matter which data source I look at. This is a good example from the question earlier of, well, how do we think about looking at demand in a robust way? Here, Google search volume is enormous. Enrollments, enormous. Online, on-ground completions, both enormous. No matter which metric I look at, this program is between the 95th and 99th percentile for all programs. What I see here is an enormous program. And once again, maybe this is not the most surprising thing to learn that a bachelor's in cybersecurity is a big program. The other thing I see is largely there are some positive signs of growth. I see that Google search volume is actually up year over year. It's actually up significantly. Nationally, it's up by 800,000 different searches. And I can see completions are up as well. Now, the question I see here is more or less enrollment is flat. So that leading indicator of Google search volume has not yet translated into an immediate increase in new student enrollment. I would say for a program like this, it's still a positive indication. It's probably something to keep an eye on to see if that big jump in Google search volume really does translate into a jump in enrollment over the subsequent terms. Looking into the employment data, I also see some pretty positive things here. Now, I think the biggest thing that jumps out to me is the size of the job market, specifically the size of the entry level job market. When we talk about entry, we're really talking about jobs that are available to graduates early in their career, specifically within the first 4 years after graduation. So, what I see here is by our measure of job postings, over 27,000 postings in the last year. And even by BLS's measure of annual job openings, their attempt to estimate how many actually available positions are there, there's still over 10,000, closer to 11,000 actually open positions. Growth is relatively modest year over year, but that's not necessarily surprising when we already have such an enormous market in terms of postings and openings for this program. So it has seen growth, but it's been a little bit more modest. I think the biggest strength I see here is the saturation. If we look at job postings per graduate, not only are there a lot of jobs, 27,000 for this program postings, but there's 2.3 postings for every single graduate of this program in the national market. So it's not just a case where there are a lot of jobs, there's an enormous number of jobs for each graduate. There's certainly enough jobs to go around, so to speak, for lack of a better way of saying it. Now, what is interesting here is what we see in the salaries. So our entry level wage data is relatively strong. It's in the 87th percentile, so stronger than the majority of other programs. Certainly a positive indication there. What I see though is this program does come back in line closer to the median program. So when we look post entry, 5 or more years after graduation, well, those are still certainly strong graduate salaries. It's in the 66th percentile, still above the median, but not as far above the median as we saw early in people's careers. So the story here is early career salaries are relatively strong, but then they fall back in line or closer to back in line with the typical program, so to speak. The last piece to point out is the underemployment. Now, for anyone who is not familiar with this metric, what underemployment is measuring is the share of graduates who go on to work in a position that does not, on paper, require the level of education they've completed. So, this is a bachelor's program. This says 25% of bachelor's cybersecurity graduates end up working in a job that does not, at least on paper, require a bachelor's degree. That might sound like a large number, and it is a relatively significant chunk of these graduates. But compared to other programs, 25% is actually very strong. It's in the 96th percentile. So, more so than the vast majority of programs, these graduates are using the education or the level of education that they have completed in the job market. Now, rounding us out here, we're going to talk a little bit about competition. And this is something we see often. This is a program that has lots of demand on the student side. It has strong employment outcomes, relatively speaking. And that's translating into a lot of competition. I say a lot of competition because 254 schools across the country have graduates for this program. And there's a little bit over 100 institutions who offer this program online. So this is both a very prevalent online program, and from the student perspective, there are lots of options. There's lots of institutions a student could choose to go and attend or complete this program. There's a couple ways you can look at that. For some institutions, they might look at this and say, well, great, this is a really popular program. It seems to be growing. The employment outcomes are strong. And we have a really strong department in this area, or a really strong reputation in this kind of area. So we think that we can, continue to draw students and be competitive in this environment. And other schools might look at this and say, well, I don't know. I don't know if I want to be the 255th school offering this program. That's more individual. I obviously won't have that context. And that's, once again, a good reminder of why this data is here to help inform your decision making, not to necessarily in any way replace it. So what I see here is a lot of competitors for this program. The flip side of that, the demand seems to be so robust that it's still translating into relatively large graduating cohorts. The average program out of those 254 has a graduating cohort of 20 students, and the median is 11. So these are by no means tiny programs. It gives you a sense of potential likely program size and even a way of categorizing that competitor list and starting to ask questions around, well, who do you as an institution compare well to? Who might you expect to be of a similar size to? And it can be helpful, especially if you're thinking about launching a new program, to think through some of those questions through that framework. The last one I'll point out, and we saw this in demand, and it also kind of goes right in line with seeing so many online players here. This is a very prevalent online program. A little over half, 55% of completions are happening online. So this is a program that is big face to face. It's also big through the online market. And when we put the pieces together and just zoom out a little bit, this is the overall scorecard for this program. We saw at the beginning, it's in the 98th percentile. So when we look at the bachelor's program in the national market, this is a very attractive market for this program. It's one that, in some cases might be a very healthy program to consider or consider investing further into if you already offer it. The last note I'm going to point out about this program is in that bottom left-hand corner here. We have a breakdown of this program across degree levels. And what I see here is not only is this a large bachelor's program, but there's a significant share of this program at associates, where 29% of the enrollment for this program is, as well as at the master's level, where 27% of this enrollment is. So think about this as a way of asking the questions of what levels, degree levels, could this type of content, at least under this zip code, be a viable program? There's already a well-established market for this program, everything from certificate up through master's degrees, and even a small amount of enrollment at the doctoral level. So this is an example of a program that is very well distributed across different levels of education. Now, that was quite a lot of data. So let me try to wrap this up for everybody and pull this all together with a few helpful takeaways. Overall, when we look at demand, we've seen some mixed signals when we look at the broad market. Google search volume is down year over year and down fairly significantly by about 36%. However, not every program falls in line with that trend. We saw programs like drafting and design tech saw some significant growth, associates and below. And we saw programs like computer programming, which saw growth bachelor's and above. We have a similar trend for enrollment. We're, for the most part, relatively flat and for some award levels down, but we do still see pockets of growth. We see associates and below, building construction management, bachelor's supply chain, and graduate artificial intelligence programs all growing very quickly. And then for the employment market, once again, we're down a little bit by about 3% year over year, but that's not across the board the case. There are occupational codes like industrial engineers that are growing very quickly, and skills across a range of areas, business, software development, manufacturing, and other areas are continuing to grow. Lastly, cybersecurity is an example of a really interesting program where there's incredibly strong demand and relatively strong employment outcomes, but it's a bit of a competitive environment. Now, we highlighted one program. There are obviously many programs, though, that are still in extremely healthy and competitive markets that it can be really helpful and interesting to review. Now, finally for today, for anyone who's new here and maybe this is your first monthly demands webinar, this is something we do on a monthly basis. So our next webinar next month, we'll review the August demand trends. It'll be September 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. For anyone who's new, once again, I really hope that you do join next month. And thank you all for joining. Hopefully I was able to fill Bob's shoes and live up to everyone's expectations. But really, thank you for joining. And if there are any questions, I can stick around for a few minutes.